So in this video, we're going to look at linear inequalities. So what a linear inequality means is that you're going to have a set of solutions versus just one. So for example, when we solved linear equations with an equal sign, we would get an answer out like x equals 5, x equals 7. Here with linear inequalities, we're going to get x must be greater than 7. So it gives us a whole set of numbers versus just one number. Your steps to solving linear inequalities are the same as linear equations. Distribute if you see any parentheses, combine like terms on the left, combine like terms on the right, move the x's over to the left. That varies a little bit different. In linear equations, we said move over the smaller one. It's going to be easier to graph if you just go ahead and get in the habit of always moving the x's over to the left. And this is just for linear inequalities. If you get a negative number, we'll take care of it by dividing through. Second to last step, undo the addition or subtraction, and then undo the multiplication or division. And here is kind of your chart for graphing. So if once you solve it, you have greater than or equal to, this chart says you're going to shade right and use a bracket. If you have just greater than, you're going to shade right and use a parenthesis. If you have less than or equal to, shade left and use a bracket. If you have less than, shade left and use a parenthesis. So you'll see down here, anytime you have greater than or less than, you just use a parenthesis. Greater than or equal to, less than or equal to, you use a bracket. If it is pointing to the right, so what I mean by that is if you were to make that thing into an arrow, it would be pointing to the right. You're going to shade to the right. Same thing with if it is pointing to the left, you're going to shade to the left. So let's do some examples. So here's your first example. X plus 4 is greater than 1. So I solved this just like I solved regular equations. I'm going to move over the positive 4. So I minus 4, get x is greater than 1 minus 4 gives me negative 3. So now when I graph that, I'm going to on Hawks, find the number line, find negative 3. Now that greater than is a parenthesis. And since it's going off to the right, I'm going to pull down the double parenthesis in Hawks. So I'll put a parenthesis here. I'll slide it down until it gets to negative 3. And then I'll slide the end parenthesis until it gets to infinity. So that would be my graph. Parenthesis and it shades to the right. Alright, so example 2, now I have a two-step equation. So I have 2x minus 2 greater than negative 9. Solve them just like before. I don't have parentheses, I don't have like terms, so I blah, 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 blah. Go all the way down to addition, subtraction. So to undo minus 2, I'm going to add 2 to both sides until I'll have 2x is greater than negative 7. Divide by 2, divide by 2. X is greater than negative 7 over 2. So because it's just plain old greater than, I'm going to have a parenthesis, and since I'm going to infinity, I need 2 parentheses. Slide your parenthesis down to 7 over 2, and then slide the other side to the infinity. Now this is what's called a open interval. So anytime you have the parentheses, that's an open interval. Anytime you have brackets, that's a closed interval, and anytime you have a combination of the two, it's called a mixed interval. So you have open and a closed. Now the last step on this one says to write it in interval notation. So step 3. So my interval notation is going to be just written, it kind of looks like a point, but it's not a point, but it's written with a parentheses, brackets, and a comma. So I have the parenthesis with the 7 over 2, negative 7 over 2. And then that thing goes off to positive infinity, so infinity always gets a parenthesis. You always are going to write it from least to greatest. So negative 7 over 2 is smaller than infinity, so I'd have that as my interval. Alright, last example. Different about this one is now it has 2 inequalities, so this is what's called a compound inequality. And the directions on this one just say solve it and graph. So when I'm solving a compound inequality, I look to the middle to tell me what do I need to do, because I want to get x by itself in the middle. So in the middle right there, how can I get x by itself? Well, first thing I have to do is get rid of the minus 2. So I'm going to add 2 to both sides. But I have compound inequality, so I have 3 parts. So I'm going to end up adding 2 to all 3 parts. So those 2's will cancel. Over here I'll have negative 14. Carry down that middle part. And then 2 plus 2 will give me 4. So now I go back to the middle. Well, I still want to get x by itself, so I'm going to divide by negative 2, divide by negative 2, divide by negative 2. Do not mess this up. When you multiply or divide by a negative number, you have to flip the sign. And in this case, flip both signs. So when I multiply or divide by a negative, I must flip the sign. So here, these signs were facing open to the right. I'm going to flip them, and they're going to be open to the left. So then I have positive 7 over here, x in the middle, and negative 2. Make sure you don't forget that. You have to flip the sign. So then my last thing is to graph it. Well, x is stuck between 7 and negative 2, so that's how it's going to look on my graph. I have negative 2, I have 7. Well, 7, that has a greater than next to it, so it's going to be a parenthesis. Negative 2 has a greater than next to it, so it's going to be a parenthesis, and then I'm going to shade in the middle.